What is going on, golf fans? It's your boy Gsluke here with our course breakdown for this week's Pebble Beach Pro-Am, another scenic venue out west. We got ourselves some primetime golf we'll be able to watch here over the weekend, and a course breakdown video here where we're going to break down everything that you need to know about this week's venue. We'll go through some of the specifics about Pebble Beach. There's actually a 3-course setup this week, so we'll go through all 3 of them for you there. Make sure you're well acquainted with what to expect. We'll go hole by hole on Pebble, the main course for this week, talk about some of our key stats, which we'll be using to identify our top plays of the week, different ways to try and get an edge, whether you're playing on DFS or, of course, betting those outrights. And we'll talk about a few of the comp courses around the PGA Tour that you might want to use for some of your analysis as well. And last week, over there at the Farmers, it was a huge success. I mean, Max Homa, deserving winner, one that we talked about at least 3, 4, maybe even like 10 times here on the channel last week. I had a feeling, going back to California, was striping the ball, just really has taken his game to the next level. And boy, oh boy, those shots on 16 and 18 told you pretty much everything you need to know about his game and really his confidence in his game going forward. I mean, that 200-yard iron shot on the par 3 just took absolute, balls of stone to go out there and do so. And then over there in 18, that 3-wood that was kind of unnecessary, but still I loved the aggressiveness the whole way through the 72nd hole. Just overall, deserved to win, and was my largest outright bet win ever. So we had that going for us. Ended up hitting pretty wildly over there on props last week, over a 75% clip. And DFS wasn't the best week, but boy, oh boy, did we carry ourselves within those other 2 categories. So had a nice week last week. Overall, looking forward to Pebble Beach, another one of those iconic venues on tour. And let's go ahead and get this thing started with a look at all 3 courses for Pebble. So a little bit of a different setup, kind of similar to the Amex, the other Pro-Am that we see this time of year. It's going to be a 54-hole cut. You've got Pebble, Spyglass Hill, and Monterey Peninsula going to be played one time each by every player in the field there Thursday through Saturday, and then on Sunday you're going to have the top 60 in ties make the weekend. Now technically the top 65 in ties are going to make the cut, but those that finish between 61st and 65th are going to end up a MDF, so essentially they made the cut but they didn't end up finishing just because they don't have enough daytime to have all those players out there. So you will see a little bit of a different cut line rule, both from the day perspective and of course from the amount of players that are actually getting through the cut line. But a similar kind of setup to what you see over there at the Amex. First things first, let's start with Pebble Beach Golf Links, the main course this week, which is iconic. Guys, we see this for the US Open. It is one of the more enjoyable tracks, both from the playing standpoint and from the visual standpoint, similar to a Torrey Pines South course that we saw last week. But this one's a lot shorter. So it's a par 72, similar from that kind of perspective, but only 6,972 yards. So nearly a 900-yard difference. And a lot of that is due to just the landscape in general. I mean, over there at the South course, there was plenty of room to add length to the course with renovations over the years. Over here at Pebble, it's already tight to begin with. So they've had to deal with the landscape at hand there, and applies a little bit of a different challenge there. In fact, when we compare the different golf courses, the South course last week was significantly more difficult than the North course. Pebble Beach was actually the second easiest course out of these 3. So Pebble Beach played 1.2 shots under par last year. Peninsula, Monterey Peninsula that is, played slightly easier at 1.5 shots under par. And then the one brute out of the 3 of them was a good old Spyglass Hill, where it played actually over par, 0.3 shots over par. So a little bit of a difference there, right? The main course this week isn't really the brute out of the 3. That's going to end up being Spyglass Hill, but it has a few challenges that make it unique, that make it actually usable for a US Open kind of setup. First off would be the greens. They're the main defense of Pebble Beach. They're only 3,500 square foot. So you're looking at on the tiny side when it comes to the size of the greens. They run it only 10.5 on the stint meter, so they're running slow as molasses out there. You're going to see plenty of players that can fill it up on the greens just because they're running that slow. You can be extremely aggressive around a Pebble Beach, and they are a Poa Annua surface, so you're looking at your typical West Coast grass. Tends to get a little bit bumpy throughout the day, as that POA tends to bud a little bit and tends to be the hardest surface to putt on. A lot of the lesser skilled putters on the PGA Tour tend to be a little bit better than average on POA, as it tends to kind of equalize the field in that category. And then you get your, West Coast specialists, guys like a McNeely, for example, that end up just loving the surface putt actually even better than their already elite baseline over there on the West Coast. So a few things to keep in mind when it comes to that grass type. Your green and regulation percentage with just 3,500 square foot greens, which again are tiny targets around Pebble Beach, was still 72.1%, which was 3.9% higher than the PGA Tour average. So say that again, even with those tiny targets, you're still hitting more than your average course. That has to do with the distance, a lot of relatively short holes on the docket, but also how receptive the greens tend to be at this coastal track and just the relative ease of the course in general. When there's no wind out there, you can play target practice with your wedges. In fact, over 20% of your shots this week on approach are going to be from the 100 to 125 yard range, let alone all the approach shots that are going to have from 75 to 100, so on and so forth. Over a third of your approach shots are going to be with a wedge in, something with a degree sign on it rather than like an 8-9 iron, that sort of thing. That's why the green and regulation percentage is as high as it is. Not so much because of the receptiveness or the size of the greens. The fairways at Pebble are extremely wide. Some people classify them as, maybe slightly wider than average, but they're 42.7 yards wide on average. That is nearly double the size of the fairways that we saw around Torrey Pines, and it's still 8 yards wider than the Tour average. And that's why we saw a fairway percentage 9.4% higher than average. So well higher than what we're used to seeing. They're at 65.3%. Or in terms of the rough, there's not that much rough around the track. There are patches of rough, though, especially in between bunkers, that sort of thing. The main thing I have to say you have to worry about would be the bunkers there at Pebble Beach. They are penal. They do have quite a bit of undulation, relatively steep faces to them as well, especially on the higher side where you have, there's a lot of undulation around this track as well. So kind of like a Torrey Pines, because it's that coastal canyon sort of landscape, you are going to get quite a bit of undulation both on the greens and on the fairways. That's another reason why they have to run the greens at 10.5 on the stint meter, because they do have quite a bit of curvature to them. But the main penalty isn't the rough. The rough, if you're hitting out of it, it's about 2 inches long. It's a rye-poa mix. It's more the side hill lies that you can get from time to time with that undulation, and then the fairway bunkers, which tend to be a little bit more penal than usual. In terms of Spyglass Hill, that's the second course. So the main course, we'll get into Pebble Beach actually hole by hole here in a second. But Spyglass Hill, the brute out of the 3 golf courses, it's by far the hardest out of the 3. It's also a par 72, but 7,041 yards, which by no means would be classified as a long course on tour, but it is slightly longer than the other 2. So I want to point that out. It's a Robert Trent Jones Sr. design in 1966. The greens are slightly larger, so it's not that long, right? The greens are actually larger at right around 5,000 square foot per green. So you might wonder where all of the difficulty comes from. It's due to the complexity. This course has tricky greens. They tend to run a lot faster than what you're used to seeing at the other 2 courses. And in fact, on the GCSAA site where they're posting all of the specifics for the tournament week this week, they have the speed of the greens at Spyglass Hill listed as quote-unquote tournament speed. Nothing else, no other explanation, no quantitative value whatsoever, just tournament speed, as they like to say over there on the Greenskeepers Association. So hard to say how that's going to end up working out. I would have to say that they run fast in general. I mean, last year they were talking about it on the broadcast, how the greens at Spyglass Hill looked like they were running at 13s. So perhaps tournament speed means they don't know how fast they're going to end up being. But from just the historical perspective, we know that the greens at Spyglass tend to run like glass, the fastest out of the 3 courses. And then on top of that, they tend to have the most undulation. It's more like a pro style setup. I have the large greens, but a lot of the greens have 3-4 tiers to them, so they play a lot smaller than their actual square footage. The fairways are also a lot tighter. They're about 10 to 15 yards narrower than what you're going to see over there at Pebble Beach. In the rough, though it's the same mix of a rye-poa mix, it's a little bit more substantial here around Spyglass. It's closer to 2.5, 3 inches long, as opposed to the 1.5, 2 inches that you have there around Pebble Beach. Spyglass Hill, a little bit more of like a big hitter, serious players golf course. Pebble Beach, It's a public golf course if you guys aren't familiar. So anyone can go out there and play. It's been a little bit more for your amateur, you to go out there and actually be able to play around. Sure, for US Opens, they will juice it up there around Pebble Beach, but for this event, for your average round around Pebble Beach, it's not going to be super gnarly rough. So that's what you're getting there. A little bit gnarlier rough, believe it or not, over there at Spyglass Hill. So perhaps driving accuracy, something you might want to pay attention to a little bit more around that track. Next up, we've got Monterey Peninsula. That's the country club over there, the shore course. They have a few different tracks over there. Beautiful tracks, I'll say all three of them, but it's the easiest by far out of the three. So it's a par 71 that's converted from a par 72. So even though it's a par 71, right, one less par 5 than the other two tracks, it plays significantly easier, and I mean way easier. And we'll talk about a few reasons why. First off, the course is only 6,957 yards. So another short track, just like the other two ones that we're dealing with. A Robert Baldock design from 1960, and the greens are by far the largest out of the three. 6,000 square foot, much closer to their PGA Tour average when it comes to that category. They're a POA running at right around a 12 on the stint meter. The fairways are by far the largest out of the three, well over 50 yards wide. So this is where a lot of the ease comes into and where a lot of the low scores come into. It's really hard to get in trouble off the tee at Monterey Peninsula. There are a few different canyons you can hit into, one or two water hazards on property that could cause you a little bit of trouble, but in general, it's wide open off the tee, has large greens that are receptive, and is a relatively short course, right? It's only 6,900 yards. So at the other two tracks where you're going to have like tricky greens, you're going to have undulation on the fairways, just tricky tee shots around Pebble Beach in general that can get you into trouble. Here at Monterey Peninsula, it's whale away at it off the tee and then just hit darts into greens. So you're not going to see nearly as many bogeys around Monterey as you will see around the other two tracks. And it's also a ryegrass rough. So a little bit different there from the agronomy perspective. It's a 1.75 inch ryegrass, and the greens are actually, what is it? It's the Spyglass greens, it's worth noting. They're POA Nua, same thing with the ones at Monterey Peninsula. But the rough over there at Monterey is the huge difference, right? It's only a ryegrass rough, so it's not that POA mix that you have. Tends to play a little bit more penal. So when you miss the rough around Monterey, you can be punished. But guys like Seamus Power last year that had success keeping it in the fairway, I mean, went nuclear around Monterey Peninsula. So there's definitely a lot of low scores to be had. You're going to see plenty of 6, 7, perhaps even that 8, 9 under par round every once in a while from elite tier guys around this track. So if you're playing Showdown, definitely want to be targeting Monterey. You're going to see the most bogey-free rounds there. You're going to see a lot of streaks there, just the best scoring average out of the three golf courses. But what makes it a slightly better target than when you get over there at Pebble is it's more protected from the wind. You have slightly more holes that are inland protected by trees. But on top of that, you also have just less variance off the tee, right? Easier tee shots, not nearly as much of a missed fairway penalty. And all of that is just a recipe for a better day when it comes to Showdown. All right, and now for our hole-by-hole breakdown. Hole number 1, 385 yards. So on the shorter end of the spectrum, it's a dogleg from left to right. So a lot of players going to hit something less than driver off the tee here. Relatively small green, but definitely not on the smaller size when it comes to Pebble. Just get used to these small targets. They're going to be a regularity. Because it's short, just something like an iron off the tee, wedge into the green. You will see plenty of birdies at hole number 1. Hole 2 is a par 4 when it comes to US Open setups. It will be a par 5 this week because it is just a par 72. And at just 519 yards, plenty of players going to get home in 2 here. In fact, if you hit the fairway, there's no excuses for you to not at the very least be greenside. Some of the tricky shots around the green here can cause players troubles, but in general, it's a straightforward short par 5 that pretty much everyone's looking to make birdie on. Hole 3 is nearly 400 yards, a tee shot where you can really cut off a lot of this dogleg. Now, the trees here don't look that substantial, but they are massive, like most of the trees here at this part of the country. If you're not familiar, there's just towering hardwood trees that you get down the coastline there. But if you're able to cut it off, you can make this an absolute just pitch and putt. You can hit it over here a little bit more aggressively towards where you see some of the carts there, some of the little markers on the ground, and leave yourself something like 75 yards and in. Now, most players will be slightly more conservative, maybe draw it around the corner, maybe just hit the high ball over those trees there. That's right around a 280-yard shot, so a lot of players can easily get their 3-wood that high. You're still only leaving yourself 100 yards in, so it's a hole where maybe the longer hitters can get a little bit more aggressive, but overall, just like hole number 1, another birdie look. Speaking of birdie looks, you're starting on the front 9. You're going to get 3 beautiful looks on your first 4 holes. And there are definitely tricky holes coming up, so not every hole is going to be this straightforward. But hole 4 is just 333 yards. You have one of the widest landing spots on the entire property, and though there's a bunker in the middle of the fairway here, you still have about 40 yards to the right of it in terms of room where most players are going to end up hitting their tee shot. And if you wanted to here, you could lay back even further, just try and be even more precise about it, and give yourself a full wedge in. You'll see plenty of guys do that, where instead of hitting something like a 3-wood out there, like 265, 270, maybe taking a little bit something off of that, go out there with like a 6-iron off the tee. Hit it like 215 yards. Maybe it's a 4 or 5-iron for a majority of the field. Those longer players could probably hit a 6-iron, 215. And then leaving yourself 120 in, which this is going to be a wedge, a degreed wedge for every single player in the field, which sometimes is easier to control than some of those field shots, right? Where you're hitting that, let's say if you're hitting a 3-wood off the tee, you're leaving yourself right about 70 yards. So you could see anything from a mid-iron off the tee on this hole, to a 3-wood, to a driving iron, to even a driver on this hole. I mean, the front edge, right, is 313 yards. If you were to try and get it in this little landing zone over here, you could see a few players be a little bit more aggressive about it. But if you miss to the left in one of these fairway bunkers, you're left with that extremely awkward 40, 50-yard bunker shot to a canyon on the other side. So blade it over, you're absolutely done for. Or miss to the right, and you're left with another similarly tricky shot there. So there's a lot of risk-reward involved there. Most players are going to be a little bit more conservative. Hole 5, one of the more iconic par 3s, not nearly as iconic as the hole we're going to get to here in a few holes, but 200 yards. You have, of course, Stillwater Cove to the right side there. Tricky green, so you definitely want to hit the surface here and just get home with a 2 putt, but it's not nearly as tricky as what you're going to see here in a few holes. So next up, we got hole number 6. It's 523, placed significantly uphill. Another relatively wide landing area, but you do have the trouble to the right. These bunkers to the left are a no-go because of how uphill the next shot is. If you end up in one of these fairway bunkers, a lot of guys are just going to lay up to the end of the fairway and then go for the green. But if you get it on the short stuff here, you can definitely get home in 2. It's about 240 yards, probably playing closer to like 260, 270 yards, given the elevation change. During U.S. Opens, with the gnarly rough that you have there, you're going to see a lot of guys just bomb it down the left, hopefully trying to hit it where some of the spectators are. But given it's this type of year, the rough isn't going to be nearly as gnarly. Guys don't have to hit it as far left. So if you're talking about guys laying up or guys maybe bailing out here, you're going to see a lot of guys hitting their tee shots from up here on the hill. And because the rough isn't as gnarly as what you got for that U.S. Open there like 3 years ago, I mean, you could still probably reach the green from over there. So it wouldn't surprise me to see a lot of players on Shot Tracker up over this way. But yeah, it's a little bit of a cheat code this time of year. Hole 7 is 112 yards. This is the most iconic par 3 in all of golf. It's way downhill, plays into the cove here. Lots of winds that'll change directions, change intensity at this part of the golf course. Not nearly as scoreable as a hole as you would think 112 yards downhill would be. It's one of the trickier par 3s that you'll see in the world. Next up is one of the holes where I believe, and this isn't where Jordan Spieth nearly died and fell off the cliff, I don't believe. It might be. It's a similar kind of setup here. I don't remember if it was on hole 8. I thought it was a hole in the back 9, but I could be wrong there. But it's a tee shot where you're going to be hitting an iron, maybe a fairway wood off the tee, laying up here to the end of the fairway. And then you have about 200 yards of true distance into this green here. The back left, back right pin locations are among the most difficult that you see on the PGA Tour. So like I said, you have a few birdie looks early, but don't get used to it because that first par 3 was difficult. You have that par 5 that's way uphill that can play a little bit tricky. Last hole, right? That downhill shot is actually extremely difficult. And then hole 8 is an absolute brute. Hole 9 is another brute. It's a 529-yard par 4. Though it plays slightly downhill, it's still extremely difficult to get on this surface in 2. You're really just hoping to get up and down, try and get out of there with a par, because hole number 10 is another punch in the face. Like I said, there's going to be birdie looks, and then you're just going to be holding on for dear life for holes 8, 9, and 10 pretty much. Nearly 500 yards, huge landing zone, but if you end up missing the short stuff here, you're going to have a hard time making a bogey, let alone getting out with something like a double. Hole 11 is 388. It's a relatively straightforward hole. In terms of trouble off the tee, it's non-existent. There's a little bit of rough to the right, but plenty of room to miss. To the left side, some trees, a little OB area that you don't want to get into, but hit something like a 3-iron off the tee. Maybe it's a 3-wood if you want to be a little bit more aggressive. You're going to have a wedge and a birdie look. Hole 12 is 214. So on the longer end of the spectrum when it comes to par 3s, but again, just get on the surface, 2-putt, get out with a par. You're going to save your aggressive looks in terms of approach shots for the much more scoreable holes, which hole 13, I would classify as a relatively scoreable hole. 450 yards, the tee shot doesn't have that much trouble in play. These fairway bunkers aren't nearly as penal as some of the other ones on property. Small surface, like every surface here around Pebble Beach, but what's new, right? Hole 14, 589. So on the longer end of the par 5s on property, in fact, the longest par 5 you have around Pebble Beach, but you can cut some of this off just depending on your distance. Of course, over here, this is meant for the amateur line. They have it at just 270 yards. You can take it over this bunker if you're one of the longer players on tour. About a 300-yard carry gets you over that. And if you're able to accomplish that, you're left with 260 in. So this 580 number, this 589 in terms of the true scorecard yardage, seems a little bit more daunting than it is in reality. But for some of the shorter hitters on tour, it's most likely a layup hole, right? If you're not able to take this bunker out of play, you're left with about 300 yards in. You can see this layup zone down the left. It's relatively sizable. You can be a little bit more aggressive, take it to the right. But no matter which route you decide to take, going to be a birdie look at the very least. Hole 15 is 398. So another one of the shorter par 4s that you're definitely looking to put it to the 5-10 feet, set up a look for birdie. Straightforward off the tee, you want to avoid that fairway bunker at all costs that's in the middle. It's a little bit deep. You can actually see some of the elevation change there on the overhead look. But if you can get it in the short stuff, real easy hole. Hole 16, same thing. So coming down the stretch, right in the middle, you get a little bit of those body blows, but hole 16, only 400 yards. I will say, because it's dogleg to the right, it can be a little bit tricky, especially if you miss in these fairway bunkers, because these trees are towering. They're large. So if you don't have the clear look into the green, it can cause some problems. And this barranca in front of the green is really, really deep. So you can't get full perspective for it with the overhead view that we have here, but it's a solid 10-20 yards below the surface, and nearly impossible to get up and down if you get in there. Hole 17, 210 yards. This hole has quite a bit of history on its own when it comes to US Opens, of course, over here with the Pebble Beach Pro-Am, but cavernous bunkers, rocks over the green that, believe it or not, will get some action this week, because the winds off of the Stillwater Cove here are so variable. You're going to get times where it's gusting at 20 and then calms down to right around 5 miles an hour, and sometimes that happens immediately. I mean, just Tom Watson comes to mind hitting off the rocks in the past, just having issues back there. Just a lot of things go right at hole 17. So hole 16, like I said, can be straightforward. I mean, hole 17 is just a par 3, right? Get it on the surface 2-putt. I know it's a tiny green. Look how narrow it is over there. It's a really tough green to actually hit in one shot. But just get out of there with a par, and you're going to be more than happy. If you end up making a birdie, you better take that for granted. It's not going to happen very often. And hole 18, it's another tough par 5. So this tree in the middle of the fairway is far more effective at blocking out shots than you may expect. So it's only set at about 290 yards here. You will see players that do hit 3-wood from time to time off the tee just because of that water to the left. It's also the only tee shot on property where you do have water to the left side. On every other tee shot, if there's going to be water, it's on the right side of this property. So it does kind of mess with you a little bit internally, makes you perhaps swing a little bit differently than you have all day. So you'll see guys miss to the left, believe it or not. That's the only thing you can't do. Guys will make that mistake. You're going to see plenty of guys that end up under this tree, have to end up laying up, that sort of thing. You saw it with a few of the leaders there last year. Jordan Spieth somebody in contention who ended up getting stuck under the tree, or just blocking it outright and ending up OB, that sort of thing. So it's a much tougher tee shot than you think. If you can get it past the tree, get something rolling in that 300-yard range, you can certainly get home in two, and you have seen eagles to end up finishing off rounds, but you've also seen bogeys and double bogeys at this hole. So the tee shot, I would classify it the most difficult on property. A lot of that doesn't just have to do with the hazards out there. I mean, what is it, hole 6 with that par 5, I would say equally amount of trouble, if not even more trouble for that tee shot. But the difference is hole 18, right? It's coming down to the wire. You're going to see a lot of people crumbling under pressure. So perhaps with the tournament on the line, a little bit of a different tee shot than what you get there on the front side. All right, fellows, now we've seen the course hole by hole, we have an idea of all 3 venues at play this week. Let's go through our key metrics for analysis that I'll be using to identify my top DFS plays, and of course, our top outrights of the week. At number 1, we've got shots gained approach, specifically looking at those wedge ranges. Like I mentioned before, 20% of your iron shots at Pebble Beach are going to come from just the 100 to the 125 yard range. Just think about all of the shots from 50 to 75, 75 to 100. So as you can imagine, looking at some of the PGA Tour proximity ranges when it comes from the 50 to 125, going to be especially important here. So shots gained approach, always going to be highly correlated to a player's success week in and week out on the PGA Tour, but even more so at a track like Pebble, where so many of those iron shots, whether it's when you lay up on the par 5s, the short par 3s, some of those potentially, semi-drivable par 4s, where a lot of guys are going to lay up and have like 100 yards in, those really come in handy for those holes. Number 2, we've got shots gained putting. And specifically, when you look at top 5, top 10 finishers, putting is a huge stat for those players. It tends to be putting specialists, guys that are a little bit shorter off the tee. And given how short all 3 tracks are, that isn't a coincidence. You would expect to see that at more of a plotter's kind of course. But also given how small the greens are, when you're going to be on the surfaces at Pebble, over there at Spyglass Hill, maybe not so much at Monterey because they have a little bit larger greens, you're going to have a really good look at birdie. So the players that are able to convert from 15 to 20 feet are going to be some of your top fantasy scores, the players that can post birdie streaks, because not every look around Pebble is going to be 5 feet in it. The greens can get a little bit firm towards the end of the week. At the beginning of the week, they'll be extra receptive. It's a Pro-Am, right? They don't want to make this super difficult, but the winds kick up. You could be looking at a little bit of a putting contest. We've seen that in a few years. A lot of the winners here, right? You're looking at prolific ball strikers. Certainly Tom Hoge, not an elite level putter. Guys like Jordan Spieth that have had a ton of success here over the years. Used to be an elite tier putter, not so much these days, yet still competes around a Pebble Beach. So it's not a prerequisite for success, particularly to win around Pebble Beach, but it has helped a ton. It's been just so correlated to success over the last 5 years. In fact, on the PGA Tour, it's in the top 15 of golf courses when it comes to correlation to shots gained putting over the entire schedule for the season. So shots gained approach, it's going to be important any specific week, but specifically at Pebble Beach, putting has been a huge X factor, especially when it comes to some of those fantasy scoring metrics. Next up, we've got shots gained off the tee, which if you saw the hole-by-hole breakdown, you probably get an idea of why. Is for the scoreable holes, the par 5s in particular, off the tee accuracy is going to do a huge deal of help for you. Now, some of the shorter par 4s where you're hitting those wedges in, off the tee is kind of irrelevant, right? A lot of times you're just hitting an iron off the tee, but for holes 8 through 10, the especially difficult stretch, if you're not going to be stout off the tee, you're going to run into issues there, probably 2-3 bogeys. But if you have your stuff off the tee, right, you can avoid all that trouble and really just lean into the easy holes. Go out there, make 4 or 5 birdies on the day. And that's how players like Tom Hoge and Jordan Spieth got it done last year. Spieth was a lot more accurate around Pebble than he typically is. Tom Hoge is about your PGA Tour average driver when it comes to accuracy. So he just had a good week when it came to his accuracy. He's not really known for that kind of ability. So like I said, shots gained off the tee, it's nice and helpful. You've seen a lot of players that are accurate have success around Pebble Beach, but it's not a prerequisite, right? We don't know Jordan Spieth for being mega accurate off the tee. We don't know guys like a Tom Hoge for being mega accurate off the tee. One thing I think that helps Jordan Spieth though would be his ball flight. He usually works it from left to right. And like I mentioned before, all of the trouble's to the right side. So what Jordan Spieth can do is he can start the golf ball away from all of the trouble on every single hole except for hole number 18 and then fade it back into the fairway. That means that if it doesn't fade, right, he hits the straight ball, he's to the left side of the fairway, no issues, right? There's no canyons over there, that sort of thing. If it fades back into the fairway, great. Those sort of players, you see courses, venues that favor one ball flight or the other. This course, at least in my opinion, at least my professional opinion, what I've seen out there, definitely favors the faders of the golf ball. So Tom Hoge, he's known for being able to fade it. He can work it both directions though, but Jordan Spieth, we know him for fading that golf ball, is not going to hit many draws off the tee, and that has been extremely helpful around this sort of track. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at off the tee numbers. A few other key stats I'm considering. Opportunities gained. So obviously in terms of fantasy scoring, that's going to be especially helpful. That's a number of opportunities a player has within 15 feet. Shots gained around the green I'm looking at. Birdie or better percentage as well. One thing I'll say about around the green, you have tiny greens around Pebble, so we know you're going to have at least a few shots to get up and down. Birdie or better percentage, another stat correlated to fantasy scoring. So kind of along the same vein as an opportunities gained, I'm looking for the players that have been just putting themselves in position over the last 4 or 5 events. Shots gained at the West Coast swing. Also taking a look at our shots gained at comp courses, which I'll get into right now. All right, and now for our comps. At number 1, we've got the home of the RBC Heritage. That would be Harbor Town Golf Links. Another shorter track. A lot of plotters tend to have success. Wind is a factor around the RBC Heritage. And you also have guys like Jordan Spieth, Tom Hoge that has had a lot of crossover success. And of course, where when we're playing in Harbor Town, I'm looking over here at Pebble Beach for a lot of my correlation analysis. Goes both ways. There's a lot of crossover, like I mentioned, a lot of those wedges, a lot of wider fairways around Harbor Town. You have a similar kind of setup over here for this week. So just a lot of correlation between the leaderboards and the skill sets for success. So definitely look at that for some comps. Number 2, you got Riviera Country Club, another one of the West Coast courses, a lot longer. It's over there for the Genesis Invitational, but another track with tiny greens. You have some of the smaller targets in all of golf. A lot of the ball strikers tend to find success around the Genesis because of that. And you also have a lot of wedges around the Genesis. And while you have plenty of holes where you have long iron in hand, there's a good mix of shorter holes that really test you with the wedge and give you those tiny targets to try and hit as well. So definitely something I'm looking at from that perspective, but also POA greens, another West Coast setup from the agronomy. So a lot of parallels that can be made there as well. And at number 3, we've got Port Royal Golf Club, the home of the Bermuda Championship. And from the agronomy standpoint, not that much similarity, right? You got the Bermuda over there at Bermuda, as you would expect. But also, just from the ball striking standpoint, a lot of parallels. A lot of wedges in hand, a lot of difficult tee shots when it comes to the undulation. A shorter track, I'll say, but the off-the-tee emphasis is still there around a Port Royal. So that's where I think a lot of the crossover is. You have a lot of wedges, a lot of emphasis in terms of your off-the-tee play. And though the agronomy isn't all that similar, there's a lot of parallels that can be made there as well. So all 3 tracks, I'm looking at the leaderboards. I'm trying to look at shots gained from those tracks. You're trying to get an idea for perhaps a few of the sleepers on the board that you might want to consider for DFS and for outrights. All right, fellows, that is all I've got for this week's course breakdown. Before you hopping out of here, go ahead, comment down below what you've got the winning score at. Personally, I'll take 17 under. With how benign the conditions look this early in the week, I expect these players to take these courses low, but go ahead and let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Would love to hear from you guys. Appreciate all the support here on the channel. You guys coming by, consuming the content as per usual. I appreciate that. Make sure to hit the like button before hopping on out of here. Also hit that subscribe button if you haven't already so you don't miss any of the content in the future. We'll have videos coming out for the DFS outrights this week. Our weekly live stream Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. You won't want to miss any of it. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. Don't miss any of the content in the future, and help me grow the brand out here, right? Help me support the channel. Appreciate all that you guys do. And best of luck, whether you're playing DFS this week, whether you are going from the outright perspective, and let's make the Pebble Beach Pro-Am a profitable one.